Hey, welcome back. We're here for this week's sermon, which is going to be from Acts 17. So I'm going to give you this time to go ahead and turn there if you'd like to read along as I read it here in just a couple of minutes. And we'll dive into it after that. I did want to say for next week, we're going to be in Acts 18 and 1 Corinthians 1. So I want you to read both of those chapters to prepare for next week and see what I may be talking about for next week's sermon. I'm looking forward to that next week as well. But I'm really excited to dive into Acts 17 today because I think there's a lot here for us to take in, to receive, and to then implement in our lives so that we can proclaim very clearly and loudly that Jesus is our King. As we get started today, let's do like we always do and spend a moment in prayer, and then we'll get right along, okay? God, we thank you for this opportunity to be together virtually, to read your word, to talk about it, to see how it might impact our lives. May we learn to be yours more completely, to give our lives over to you in service so that we are changed and new people because of who you are and what you did for us. We thank you for your son, Jesus. I pray this morning that as I talk about Acts 17, that you would give me the words to speak. Give to me the gift of preaching this morning. It's through your son, I pray all of this. Amen. Okay, I do want to read from Acts 17, beginning in verse 1, going through verse 9, and then we will pick up and talk about it. The word of the Lord from the book of Acts. Paul and Silas then traveled through the towns of Amphipolis and Apollonia and came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As was Paul's custom, he went to the synagogue service, and for 3 Sabbaths in a row, he used the scriptures to reason with the people. He explained the prophecies and proved that the Messiah must suffer and rise from the dead. He said, "This Jesus I'm telling you about is the Messiah." Some of the Jews who listened were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with many God-fearing Greek men and quite a few prominent women. But some of the Jews were jealous, so they gathered some troublemakers from the marketplace to form a mob and start a riot. They attacked the home of Jason, searching for Paul and Silas so they could drag them out to the crowd. Not finding them there, they dragged out Jason and some of the other believers instead and took them before the city council. "Paul and Silas have caused trouble all over the world," they shouted, "and now they are here disturbing our city too. And Jason has welcomed them into his home. They are all guilty of treason against Caesar, for they profess allegiance to another king named Jesus." The people of the city, as well as the city council, were thrown into turmoil by these reports. So the officials forced Jason and the other believers to post bond, and then they released them. It's a really interesting story. It's funny because Paul and Silas kind of disappear in the second half, right? They're there in the first half, teaching and preaching and telling both the Jews and the Greeks there about Jesus, and doing so quite, to great applause, or they were getting some converts. And then all of a sudden they disappear, and not sure where they went, but they're just not there anymore in this part of the story. But it's a really exciting sort of story. There's a lot that's happening here. So I want to dive into a couple of major things to talk about. The first one is that Jesus is King, or maybe the question, how is Jesus Messiah? What does that look like? And how does Paul rather talk about Jesus? You see, Paul's major point to the Thessalonians here is to prove that Jesus is King. And as we'll discuss more in a few minutes, this claim that Paul and Silas are making and teaching about, it has profoundly political and life-altering ramifications for those who might begin to believe and even turn their lives over to God. This isn't just about a quick, "Oh yeah, I think I'll go with that now." Or, "Yeah, Christianity sounds cool, I might try that out for a while." We have that sort of mentality among some people in our culture and society. That is not the way that the ancient world would have thought about it. To go from belief in this one thing to this new thing would have meant a complete life alteration. Everything about you would have to change. And this is such a major thing, this theme, this idea of Jesus being king for Paul with the Thessalonians, that in his first letter to them in First Thessalonians, he wrote to them about Jesus and referenced Jesus as Messiah 10 times. I don't know if you've looked at First Thessalonians recently, but it's not a long letter. So we know a couple of things about Thessalonica just from history and archaeology and all those sort of things. And I think these couple of things help us understand the importance, the impact of Paul's message to them. The first thing is that Thessalonica was a major port city. As such, it would have had a strong Roman influence, because there's no doubt the Caesar, the Romans would have wanted to exert major influence over a major port city like this. So it would have had a strong military Roman presence, because they would have needed to be there to secure the interest of Rome, of the empire. And so because of that, there would have been a lot of Romans or a lot of Italians who would have moved there, and there's no doubt that they would have made at least portions of that city very much like the feel of Rome. They would have changed architecture. They would have set up certain social things to feel like Rome. They wanted to carry that with them because they believed Rome held all the answers. Everything that Rome did was good, was wise, was perfect. And so why not take that with you wherever you go? That's the sort of thing that they would have done. They also then would have carried with them that worship of Caesar, that belief that Caesar is some sort of demigod, right? That he is so powerful and so magnificent. And so this began to exert a strong influence over the Thessalonians. Not just that, but secondly, Thessalonica was full of idols, of idol worship. And the worship of idols in Thessalonica influenced every aspect of their lives. Idols weren't just for religious purposes. It wasn't the sort of thing that, hey, we're going to pull that out and just do it for this 30-minute time period where we worship it and then it goes back in the closet. That's not the way that idols worked in Thessalonica. There was a deep influence of idol worship over politics, over religious life, of course, but also over social life. To give up an idol, to change from one to the other, as I already mentioned, would be a wholesale change of the person. It made a significant statement about who you were and what you were trying to do based on the idol that you worshipped. And so these decisions to give up an idol, to stop worshiping idols, as Paul is trying to get the people to do, it's not a small decision. This isn't a quick change from one to the other. It was going to change everything about their lives to make that decision. And so they're not made easily nor quickly. That decision by those who chose to follow Paul here and listen to his message, it made a profound impact on them, as I just said. But not just on them. It made a profound impact on other people. Well, how do we know that? We don't get that here in Acts 17. Well, actually, we see that by looking at Paul's letter to them in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 8 through 10. I want you to hear what Paul says to them about them. He says, "And now the word of the Lord is ringing out from you to people everywhere, even beyond Macedonia and Achaia. For wherever we go, we find people telling us about your faith in God. We don't need to tell them about it, for they keep talking about the wonderful welcome you gave us and how you turned away from idols to serve the living and true God. And they speak of how you are looking forward to the coming of God's Son from heaven, Jesus, whom God raised from the dead. He is the one who has rescued us from the terrors of the coming judgment." I think you can see there how their lives were influencing not just themselves and not just the immediate people around them, but they were affecting Christians for many miles, maybe hundreds of miles away from them. What an amazing testament that Paul tells them in this letter that he wrote to them about their faith and how their giving up idols demonstrated their great faith for Jesus and their love for Jesus and how that was making a huge impact on other people, probably facing and struggling with the same sort of decision, right? The message that Paul rolls into town with is an invitation to new life, which is what we were just talking about, that change from one to the other, which is not an easy change. New life means that you have to change everything about who you are. We all know that, right? With this invitation to new life, we're very familiar with that language. We're familiar with what that means and how that works, at least to a point. But try and think about it from the perspective of the Thessalonians. As far as they're concerned, before Paul shows up, they're cogs in the machine of the Roman Empire. They work and pay taxes to a self-proclaimed divine emperor, right? Who, for all they can tell, doesn't actually maybe care about them at all. And then Paul shows up, and he begins to tell them this different message. No, there is a king, there is an emperor out there who does actually care for you. And so Paul starts talking about God, about Jesus, who really does care about them. And he cared enough to send his son to enrich their lives. He cared enough to send his son to give them meaning and purpose. He cared enough to let his son die and then be raised to new life again. And that message seemed to resonate with the Thessalonians very strongly. And Paul hinges his whole teaching, his whole message to them, actually on the resurrection, which he believes to be the most important aspect of Jesus' earthly life. In verse 3 of Acts 17, we read that Paul explained the prophecies to them about the Messiah, about how he must suffer and rise from the dead. Now, a lot of times in our teaching and our preaching and our thinking about God, about Jesus and his life, we're really good at capturing that suffering part. Oh, he's the suffering servant. Wow, how important. And it was. But if that's all Jesus did, is suffer, that's not a very sympathetic God. That's not a very powerful God. But to rise from the dead, to come back to life after not breathing anymore, there's the power. There's the hope. There's the turning point to something new, to a greater and new sort of life. And the whole message that Paul is preaching, that Paul and Silas are preaching, hinges on this truth, right? It stands or falls on the truth of the resurrection. And so the resurrection cannot be discarded. It can't be tossed aside. It is that important. And of course, we talked about that a couple weeks ago on Resurrection Sunday. And so the Thessalonians seem to have really taken this to heart. They seem to have understood this truth that Paul is trying to get across to them. And what's interesting is, when I read from 1 Thessalonians just a couple minutes ago, did you catch how Paul talked about Jesus after he mentioned Jesus' name? He said, right, how he's heard about their faith from so many other people, how he doesn't even have to talk about them, like he doesn't have to build them up and flaunt their faith to other people. Other people are doing that to him. They're reminding him how great the Thessalonians are. But when he wrote the name Jesus, he added this right after, whom God raised from the dead. Now, the Thessalonians know that God raised Jesus from the dead. Paul mentioning this right after saying the name Jesus, it's not going to catch them off guard. It's not going to surprise them. This is the very message they believed, right? So why does he say this? Why include this statement right there? It strikes me as the sort of thing that groups or nations do sometimes. Like, you'll have a group of people, maybe a country, that when they say long live the queen, they also add, and may she live forever, or may she reign forever, something like that. There's, some sort of like, this is an addendum all the time to when we talk about this person. I wonder, obviously this is pure speculation, I don't have any proof that this is really what was going on, but it strikes me to be, I don't know, it makes it more rich to think about it this way. That I wonder if, because when Paul talked about Jesus with them, maybe he mentioned the resurrection so much that in their minds, Jesus and whom God raised from the dead are so inextricably linked, right? They cannot be separated. Those two things are married together, that when Paul is writing this to them, he's reminding them of their little inside joke that, I can imagine that while Paul and Silas were there talking about Jesus, And he says this over and over again. Jesus, whom God raised from the dead. And then he goes on, he talks about Jesus more. Jesus, whom God raised from the dead. That it became this inside joke among the Thessalonians who began to follow Jesus and to heed Paul's words, that they started saying, anytime somebody said Jesus, whom God raised from the dead, that now Paul is playing back into that inside joke, reminding them, hey, I remember this, and this was a fun time together. I don't know if that's true. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But to me, it adds that richness of the relationship that Paul would have had with his churches. And we know clearly that he had a good relationship with the Thessalonians. Just look at the way that he talks about them. Look at how he encourages them. There's no doubt that he had a powerful relationship with them. So what do we see happen as Paul begins to tell them about Jesus in Acts 17? Some of them were persuaded. The message is sinking in. Praise God, right? But not all of it's happy. And not all the people there are happy with Paul and Silas's message to the Thessalonians. Some of the Jews whip up a mob into a riot. They charge Paul and Silas with the crime of treason against Caesar. And this leads me into the second major point that I want to look at here and end with. And that is that Christianity is political. It's one of the many things that Christians don't want to admit, and don't want to talk about, is that Christianity is political. And it has been from the very beginning. Jesus wasn't crucified for being a nice man who happened to have a large crowd of people following him. That is not why he was crucified. He was crucified because he angered the wrong people by allowing himself to be proclaimed king. Christianity is political. To make a claim that Jesus is king is not just a religious statement. It's not just a heart statement. It is a political statement. Because of that fact, and based on the New Testament writings and other early Christian writings that we have, we know that proclaiming Jesus as king had significant consequences for the people who made that choice. As Christianity spread to the empire at large, it became more and more dangerous, and we see record of that. We have record of Christians dying for their faith because they proclaimed Jesus as king. It wasn't just the Jews looking to quell this new upstart religion. Caesar wasn't happy with any arrivals to his allegiance. And to me, this whole conversation that we've had today and that we see in Acts 17 can be summed up by talking about this aspect of it. Because Christianity is both religious and political, it isn't just about believing Jesus is king. It is about being willing to proclaim that he is king in any and all circumstances. To other Christians and also to all non-believers. And okay, so we live in a place where we don't face a whole lot of persecution, right? We're not going to face punishment for proclaiming Jesus as king. We don't really need to live in fear of physical or non-physical harm or even death by proclaiming ourselves as Christians and proclaiming Jesus as king. It also doesn't mean that we live in a place where it's all roses and peaches and happy times because we claim to follow Christ. We know that's not true. And though we'd all like to live somewhere where maybe that were true, where it would just be happy times because everybody is a Christian, we don't live there. And trying to make that happen, I'm not sure if that's the real... I mean, obviously we want everybody to be Christians. But I think the reality that we face is that not everybody will. And so forcing people to think like we do and believe like we do, I don't think is the main goal of who we are. Our goal is to present the message like Paul and Silas did and let other people respond to it. So our main goal is to remain faithful no matter what happens. No matter what persecution we may face or ridicule we may face, we must remain faithful. It matters that as Christians, We refuse to place our hope and trust in any political system, whether that be through voting. We've got to quit placing our hope and trust in a voting system. We got to quit putting our hope and trust in a dictatorship or in this or that other political system. That can't happen any longer. Our allegiance, our hope and trust cannot be there. We have to stop. It's important that we stop putting our hope and trust in any politician, any woman or man, or in any political party. Because let's face it, there isn't a political party, whether in this country or outside of it, there is not a political party that truly stands for what we as Christians stand for. Every political system, every politician is flawed. Plain and simple. It's just how it is. And that's why our first allegiance cannot be to a country. It cannot be to a flag. It cannot be to a man or a woman. It cannot even be to our blood, to our family. Our first allegiance must be to Jesus as King. There were a lot of Romans at the time of Paul who I think probably wanted to become Christian. They liked the message, but they struggled with getting over that fact that they would have to proclaim Jesus as King. You have to think about it from their perspective. They've grown up their whole lives hearing Caesar is Lord, Caesar is Lord, Caesar is Lord. And to proclaim otherwise is heresy and is punishable. So now to all of a sudden proclaim Jesus as Lord, Jesus as King, would fly in the face of everything that they've known and been taught and have come to believe about the way the world works. And this is why earlier I talked about changing from one idol to no idols, or from worship of idols to no idols, or from one to another. It is a huge, huge thing. It's not just a simple, yep, I think I'll stop that and go for that. It changes everything about who you are. And the Romans were put in danger. The Greeks were put in danger because they might proclaim Jesus as King. I mean, if their coworkers, family, friends heard them say Jesus is King, their lives might be in danger. And I wonder what that same proclamation does for us today. Does it turn people away from us? Does it put us in danger? Probably not. But has it hurt relationships because we decided, no, this is the direction I need to go. I need to be a follower of Jesus. And if I have to leave some friends behind, if I have to leave this relationship or that relationship behind, it's worth it because Jesus is worth it. Those are the sort of things that we have to think through. And we have to be very honest with people about the ramifications of choosing this life when we talk to them about who Jesus is. Proclaiming Jesus as King must change all of who we are. Not just one part of it, not just one aspect, not just our religious life, but it has to change our political life. It has to change our social life. We have to see the world differently and understand the world differently because of who Jesus is. And if our allegiance is divided, right, Jesus himself says, you cannot serve two masters. If our allegiance is divided, then we are not truly his. You may think you are, but if your allegiance is divided between God and something or someone else, then you are not truly God's. We must offer up all of ourselves in total allegiance to the one politician worth it all, the one ruler worth it all, to the one king worth it all, because he sacrificed it all for our sake and then was raised again to new life. Jesus, whom God raised from the dead. I want to conclude with a question to you this morning. And I want you to think about your life so far and about when you gave it over to God. Because the question is, how did your life change when you first proclaimed Jesus as King? If the answer to that is nothing, then it may be time to re-examine what needs to change since I proclaimed Jesus as King. But the truth is we can all answer that question. Something about us has to change because we proclaim Jesus as King. So for you, for me, what is it that needs to change? When we proclaim Jesus as King, it ought to change our lives. What needs to change for us? That's Acts 17. A really powerful message, I think, a really impactful one, not just for the Thessalonians, but also for us. And the way that they were willing to go from this to that, from worship of idols to worship of God, is really amazing, and a great message and lesson for us to learn as well. That's it for today. I've enjoyed being with you in this way. Again, I hope that these messages are a blessing to you and helpful to you during this pandemic, during this time of social distancing. Please reach out if you have any need whatsoever. We want to hear from you as a church. We want to help take care of you. So whatever needs you have, please let us know about them. I look forward to being back again with you at some point in the future. For now, we're going to keep doing this, and look next week. Look for my my little mini class lessons. I'll be posting a couple of those, and I look forward to being back with you then. So have a great weekend. Have a great Sunday, a great time of worship together with your family. And I will see you again very, very soon. Take care.